ist 8 Milliarden, der Auslandspodcast des Spiegel mit einer Sonderfolge zum Ukraine-Konflikt. Keine Sorge, verehrte Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörer, die reguläre Episode erscheint ebenfalls wie gewohnt am heutigen Freitag. Aber in dieser Woche ergab sich die besondere Gelegenheit für mich, bei einem exklusiven Interview meiner Kollegen aus dem Auslandsressort dabei zu sein, in dem es darum geht, was Wladimir Putin mit dem massiven Truppenaufmarsch an der ukrainischen Grenze vorhat. Wir senden dieses Interview in voller Länge, nur leicht bearbeitet, und wir senden es ausnahmsweise im englischen Originalton. Zu Gast sind 3 Expert Innen, die sich seit vielen Jahren mit Russland und speziell mit Wladimir Putin beschäftigen. Masha Geesen, eine russisch-amerikanische Journalistin und Schriftstellerin. Er schreibt für das Magazin New Yorker, hat Putins Aufstieg und seine Karriere regelmäßig kommentiert und hat über ihn die Biografie Der Mann ohne Gesicht geschrieben. Für sein Sachbuch Die Zukunft ist Geschichte, wie Russland die Freiheit gewann und verlor, wurde sie mit dem Leipziger Buchpreis zur europäischen Verständigung ausgezeichnet. Nina Khrushcheva lehrt als Professorin für internationale Politik an der Universität New School in New York City. Auch sie beschäftigt sich schon lange mit ihrem Heimatland und hat viele Artikel und Bücher über die Entwicklung Russlands geschrieben. Zuletzt In Putins Footsteps, Searching for the Soul of an Empire Across Russia's 11 Time Zones. Sie ist außerdem die Enkeltochter des ehemaligen russischen Staatschefs Nikita Khrushchev. Last but not least beantwortet auch Sabine Fischer die Fragen meiner Kollegen. Sie arbeitet für den Think Tank Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, ist Mitglied des Europa- und Transatlantik-Gremiums der Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung und hat intensiv zu den staatlichen Strukturen Russlands und der Beziehung zu Deutschland geforscht. Die Fragen stellen meine Kollegen Christoph Scheuermann und Maximilian Popp aus der Leitung des Spiegel-Auslandsressorts und unser Moskau-Korrespondent Christian Esch. Ich wünsche Ihnen spannende Unterhaltung bei dieser englischen Spezialausgabe. Und nicht vergessen, die reguläre Folge von 8 Milliarden, die sich in dieser Woche mit der deutschen und europäischen Sicht auf den Ukraine-Konflikt beschäftigt, erscheint ebenfalls heute.
Welcome, Nina Khrushcheva, joining us from the New School in New York, Professor of International Affairs, Masha Geesen, author for the New Yorker, who has written extensively about Putin and Russia, and Sabine Fischer from the German think tank in Berlin, SWP. This is an experiment for us because it will be a 3-way interview, both for the magazine in a print version and a digital version, and as a podcast that we publish online. From Der Spiegel, it's Maximilian Popp, foreign editor, Christian Esch, Moscow correspondent, currently in Kiev, and Olaf Häuser, our podcast and audio colleague, who will try to make a audible product out of this, and we're very excited that you can join us. So, without further ado, I would ask Christian to ask our first question, and we're all looking forward to the discussion.
All right. Maybe let me start with a kind of an alarmist question to get us going. Maybe first to you, Masha, but also to everybody else. Is a new Russian invasion, a new Russian military intervention in Ukraine imminent? Is it avoidable? Is it something that's just, do we just see a mechanism play out, and are we watching something big happening there?
The answer is we don't know. What we know is that we're observing a buildup to an invasion a larger scale invasion. Let's not, there's something that troubles me about all of these conversations that I've been having both in the United States and in Russia, where people talk about the possibility of war as though Russia hadn't been at war with Ukraine for 7 years now, 8 years, actually. So what we're seeing is clearly preparation for a much larger scale invasion, where we saw the buildup of troops for several months. Now, as of this week, we see the pullout of diplomats from Russian diplomats from Ukraine. And just today, the Communist Party, which is one of the Kremlin parties in the totally Kremlin-dominated parliament, has introduced legislation that would recognize the so-called separatist regions of Ukraine as sovereign states, which clearly creates illegal, to the extent that that such a thing can be seen as legal, a legal pretext for a larger scale invasion by Russia. Does that mean it's going to happen? We will find out when it happens. If your question about whether it's avoidable is a question about whether the United States and NATO can do anything to make it not happen, I very much doubt it.
Nina, Sabina, what's your view on this?
Yeah, maybe if Nina doesn't want to continue then right now, then perhaps I will continue. I would agree with Masha. What we're seeing is clearly a preparation, and we really don't know what is going to happen, also because, we're dealing here with a political system that is completely non-transparent, and it is very, very difficult in this extremely not polarized, but centralized and personalized political system to understand what decision will be taken in the end. And this is exactly the strategic ambiguity, if you like, that benefits the Russian side at the moment, because clearly at the moment, and specifically since Russia published the two draft treaties in December, Russia has the initiative. And the West is basically running after and trying to catch up, really, because of this very threatening situation along the Russian-Ukrainian border. From my experience and my assessment, I am a little doubtful, and this is actually, I'll be very interested to hear what both Nina and Masha have to say about this. I'm a little doubtful about real intentions to invade, because already now the costs would be significant for the Russian side, and also the gains are extremely doubtful, in my view, because, as a matter of fact, Russia controls the disputed territory in the east of Ukraine. And I don't think that the force that we're seeing along the Russian-Ukrainian border right now would be enough to really venture out towards and take Kiev, for instance. So to me, these are all huge question marks, and I think we also need to see the situation along the Russian-Ukrainian border in connection with the draft treaties and the diplomatic offensive, if you like, that Russia has taken in December, which is really aiming at changing the European security order. So it's a threat game that Russia is playing. And the big question to me is, will we reach a point where the rationale and the calculus behind these Russian moves change, and where Moscow and the Kremlin come to the conclusion that diplomacy is not working, and that there need to be other measures? And here I think, one big problem that I see is the draft treaties were published, and they contain maximalist positions and claims. And it will be difficult for Moscow to walk away from these maximalist positions without damage to their own position. And also, without damage, it will be difficult to do that in a face-saving manner.
Nina, what would you say? Threatening posture or imminent invasion?
I don't think it's an imminent invasion. Not that I disagree with Masha. I think it is sort of a Putin's stance generally is to keep everybody in suspense. One of the reasons I actually agree that what's the point of, imagining Putin going into Kiev is insane. Not that it cannot happen, but it's a little insane. What is he going to do with a 40 million country that hates his guts? There's so much force that needs to be installed there. We've already seen in recent days just over a conversation of imminent invasion. The banks completely falling apart. All the stocks are falling apart. I think Sberbank has lost, 20% of its value. And German Gref, the president, is certainly not happy. So I don't see the reason for the imminent invasion, but it is a very classic Putin, in a sense, to kind of, I'm going to have a posture and you deal with it. So that is something that we need to consider. And then the question is how much escalation is going to happen for him to get to the point when he feels like he's respected and recognized, which is sort of the usual Russian drama, is that we are not respected and recognized, and you are sitting as at a children's table next to the toilet, but we want to be seated at the regular table and whatnot. I mean, this is an endless conversation. So we don't know how much escalation he would need to take to back off, and what also the NATO and Ukraine and American response would be, because so far they've been holding strong. And I actually think that Putin is losing that battle, because I don't think that all this preparation of troops was to invade. It was to make a point, is to force his message in a sense. But the United States decided that it's going to take this threat at face value, and they've been really running with it. And by now we already have a conversation of how much Russia is going to be sanctioned, almost regardless of whether they're going to invade or not, because it's a threat to European security as is. So I think that this is something that we've experienced with crisis before, is that who will blink first. And once again, why I'm saying that I actually think that Russians are not necessarily in a strong position, although Putin, I'm sure, thinks he is because they've recently started saying, well, we'll put troops in Latin America. We'll put troops in Cuba. Like, right, that's the Cuban Missile Crisis all over again. You can really have this kind of forceful and unbending stance, not out of strength necessarily, but more out of weakness, sort of your last line of defense. So I would think that if Putin, threatens us long enough, he may consider, and actually Sergei Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, already said, I think yesterday, the day before yesterday, is that, well, one of the options is that the United States just promises that it's not going to be part of the Ukraine NATO inclusion. So this is, in a way, already a step back. So we will see how many more steps back and forth both sides, or actually 4 sides, because there are 4 sides to this conversation now, can take.
Why is that all happening now?
There are a couple of reasons. One is that, none of them really have to do with Ukraine. And that's a really huge problem with this conversation, right? The way we're having it and the way that it's generally been had all over the world, which is that it's never about Ukraine. It's about anything but Ukraine. It's about anything but the Ukrainian people. But for Putin, I think it also doesn't have to do with Ukraine, and it doesn't have to do with Ukrainian territory. It has to do with his waning popularity. And as odd as this is, he is, in fact, concerned and increasingly concerned with his popularity rating, to the extent that it can even be measured. I think it has to do with his sense that he needs to leave a historical legacy and his question about what happens next. I mean, he is an old man. All around him, he is seeing crises of similar personified autocratic regimes and basically seeing how they hit it at a dead end. He's seeing Belarus, where the regime survives only through the use of force and basically with Russian funding. He's seeing Kazakhstan, where a smooth non-transition went awry. And again, the regime can only be propped up through force. And so he's looking for alternatives to an imagined, a predicted crisis, right? That has to do with his waning popularity and sort of the big looming question about transition. And he remembers that last time annexing Crimea worked really, really well. It was fast, it was relatively inexpensive, and even in terms of sanctions. And yes, I see Sabina shaking your head, but I will make my case for it being relatively inexpensive, right? And it propped up his popularity rating in an unprecedented way for a very, very long time, right? And yes, absolutely, the ruble tumbled upon invasion of Crimea. There were a variety of sanctions, but from a 7-year out perspective, it looks pretty good. It looks like both the devaluation of currency and the sanctions actually stimulated domestic production. That it looks like it actually helped mobilize the population because the world was against us. So on the whole, it really looks like it was less costly than it was beneficial. And I think he's looking for a way to reprise it. There's no Crimea, right? That was a unique situation. But in the way that the Kremlin has, it's looking, in that same direction because that's where it benefited the last time.
Can I jump in? Yes. I'm sorry for shaking my head, Masha. No, I mean, I absolutely do agree with most of your points. I would add that there may be a sense of window of opportunity in Moscow right now, including because I think there's a strong sense of Western weakness. I mean, something that we in Germany clearly. I'm not so sure about the US, but maybe Masha and Nina can comment on this. But we have almost forgotten the disastrous impact on the Western reputation that came from the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I mean, in Russia, this was huge. And I think there is a very strong sense of Western weakness, also with a view to, this goes for the US, also with, looking at the domestic situation in the United States. And of course, the Biden administration also very much focusing on domestic issues. Both Germany and France are in transition situations, really, with a new government in Germany and presidential elections ahead in France. So, all this may be seen from the Kremlin as really a window of opportunity to act and also to get concessions from Western players simply because they're less attentive, they're weak, and perhaps not able to coordinate properly. And I agree here with, I think, what Nina said, which obviously didn't work so far. I mean, this may also turn out to be a huge miscalculation on the part of the Kremlin. Very briefly on Crimea, I agree, the Crimea effect was extremely strong, and the annexation of Crimea was really about Crimea. I mean, here with the Donbass and with what we have right now, I think it's different. We have different dimensions and different levels, including the European security level, including very strongly the relationship between Russia and the United States, NATO, etc. The Crimea was really about Crimea, and I really would stress that it's not possible to repeat that. And also when you look at opinion polls, etc. I mean, Donbass isn't anywhere near playing a role also in Russia in the thinking of ordinary Russians. That is similar to the role of Crimea. So, so I'm a little hesitant to make that comparison.
That's an interesting discussion. Nina, can I ask you perhaps maybe moving on to Putin's sort of view on Ukraine? What does Ukraine sort of mean emotionally for Putin? How does he view this country?
Well, he has been, he's a well-known historian. He has been very interested in this in the subject, and particularly the subject of Ukraine. The whole Crimea, of course, we're going back to the historical roots, and that's so important to us. You may remember that. So the Vladimir the Great, the first Russian Christian, the baptizer of the Kievan Rus, has a giant monument in Kiev, a very important monument. I think it was built in 1853, I believe. And then Joseph Stalin, who destroyed all the, or Soviets destroyed all the monuments to the Tsars, actually kept that monument of Vladimir the Great, and in fact refurbished the monument in 1953, and Stalin died shortly, so he couldn't enjoy it. So when Kiev became completely independent, Kiev, particularly after Crimea's annexation in 2014, what does Putin do? He builds his own Vladimir the Great right next to the Kremlin. It was supposed to be elsewhere, but it's very important that it's right next to the Kremlin. Then very recently, I think last summer, he wrote a giant, very big article of how Ukraine and Russia, the same people, essentially were brothers and brotherly nations, and the West wants to break it up, following in footsteps of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was first to argue in the late 80s that basically the pan-Slavic Russian world consists of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, and that needs to be all brought together. So it's a big issue for him. But I agree with Masha that still, whatever is happening, in fact, both for the United States and Russia, it's not really about Ukraine. It's about something that Putin has been talking about. It's about sphere of influence. It can be, Ukraine is important because it is, in their understanding, it's the brotherly nation, essentially the same kind of, came out of the same history, the same culture, the same roots, and so on and so forth. He actually said it even more in the Crimea speech in 2014, in March 2014, the famous Crimea speech. Ukraine is important, but I really don't believe that Kyiv is something that he wants to go to. And I agree that the poll numbers, Crimea was a separate case, and the poll numbers are not there. The Russians would like to have Odessa. They would like to kind of have the honor of the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, as part of their leverage. Global leverage in a sense. But we also need to remember, and I think Masha is right, that he's getting old and he's, all these old regimes around him are collapsing and they need to be propped up by force. I'm not sure that force is necessarily invasion of Crimea, although he probably may get a little more reckless than he was before, because one of the things about Putin, at least in the last 20 years, it may be changing because he's aging, is that he's a gambler. I mean, we've seen it, but he's a very calculated gambler. He's a very careful gambler. He doesn't bite more than he can actually chew. And so I still doubt that he thinks that he can chew off Ukraine. And I don't think it just, and the poll numbers in Russia really are not there to support that kind of invasion or with propaganda, you can move it forward, but it just doesn't seem to be an easy case to win at this point.
He wouldn't have to bite off all of Ukraine. He could bite off 1/3 or so.
Yes, and that's what I'm saying. I mean, there's a possibility that some parts of it, sort of closer to the east or to Russia's west, still, I mean, that Donbass, Lugansk, Odessa, Mariupol, all these places are still a possibility. Then the question is how much they are, because the sanctions that can happen are not going to be the sanctions of 2014, because we've seen it with Victoria Nuland, we've seen it with Anthony Blinken. They're almost making up for the things that they didn't do. They kind of chickened out in 2014. So now they're completely ready. I mean, they're just ready as it comes. I mean, I think they're just waiting for him to make a wrong step and just go for it. So the question is how well they understand it in the Kremlin, who is advising, who is exactly now left to advise Putin. But I do think, I mean, when I listen to Ryabkov, not even Lavrov, because Lavrov, I think, is purposely trolling whatever the West is. I mean, they find inconsistencies and just go into them. But listening to Ryabkov, who seems to be the spokesperson, although I'm sure he has dictations from up top, he kind of goes off and says, no, we need firm confirmation, but then he does sound conciliatory. He actually said, I think yesterday, that we don't see the big war in Europe, and stock markets immediately went up, which made a lot of people happy. So I think we're still, basically what we're discussing is that continuous ambiguity that does work for Putin, certainly, but at the same time, any wrong step and Russia will be buried.
May I just very briefly add something here? I said it before. I agree with that analysis. And really, one has to ask the question, what would be the gains of, for instance, a full-fledged military occupation of the already basically, the territories that are already not under the control of the authorities in Kiev. What would be the gain? And I agree with Nina. I really don't see them, and I think they would be completely outweighed by the costs that Russia would face. And this is why I think, there's one possibility that we haven't discussed yet, and that in my view is actually the greatest risk. And this is that the situation at some point simply spirals out of control. This is a huge risk in my view, including because, we have, I think the Donbas conflict as such has changed structurally over the past few years, mainly because the Russian side in 2018-19 started to pursue a very systematic and targeted passportization policy. So now we have, I don't have the exact number now, around 600,000 Russian citizens in those territories. And we still have a very volatile situation along the contact line. And we have additional new factors, for instance, Turkish drones in Kiev. And we already had one such incident in October, which was very badly received in Moscow. So at some point, the situation could escalate, simply spiral out of control, and Moscow would see itself in a position where it would have to react. This could make for a very, very difficult situation. Other than that, I think what is much more likely than any kind of full-fledged military invasion is hybrid steps. This is already happening. We all know that it has been happening for years. And I think if the Russians really go for what Putin calls the military technical steps, then we will probably face a lot more hybrid intervention in Ukraine, but also steps, for instance, in Belarus and other parts of the region.
I would like to pick something up that Masha and Nina, both of you mentioned, and that is Putin's legacy. He's 69 years old. He's in power for more than 20 years. What does he want to achieve from now on? And how does he want to be remembered?
I think that's a great question. And I think that we have certainly seen Putin try to lay the groundwork for his place in history, especially in the last couple of years. I'm glad Nina brought up the article he published in September, which I think Nina, you might have given a very kind rendition of it. It was really it did have that sort of the brotherly nations rhetoric, but it was really an attack on the very idea of the possibility that Ukraine can be a sovereign state. And then after that, Putin's little sidekick, Dmitry Medvedev, published I think he published two articles, right? That one of which was just bizarre and anti-Semitic and very explicit in sort of attacking this possibility of Ukraine as a state. And finally, I hate it when we all sort of devolve into this kind of Kremlinology of like, let's look at the signals, but it's kind of unavoidable. And so during the Kazakhstan crisis, when was it, last week? There was this weird moment because Russia was still in its prolonged holiday phase, so the propaganda machine was a little slow kicking into gear. They were waiting for instructions from the Kremlin on how to spin Kazakhstan. And it was like this moment when it finally kicked into gear, and Margarita Simonyan, who's the head of the Russia Today propaganda monolith, started tweeting that all of this is a result of the delusion that the former republics can be sovereign states, and that this puts all of them on notice, right? And so I think what we're seeing is, to the extent that Russia is capable of a concerted campaign, it is kind of a concerted campaign to reposition Russia in the Putin era as an empire that is being restored to its former grandeur. I think that Putin wants to go down in history as the gatherer of lands, not an unprecedented concept in Russian history. I think it would be a mistake to look at Soviet borders. It's not a question of whether he wants to restore the Soviet Union, right? It's really about imperial grandeur. But his greatest achievement to date is returning Crimea, right? So the question he's really asking is, what else can I return? What can I be remembered as having brought back into the fold after the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of our time made us lose things that were rightfully ours, right? And that really informs his ongoing conversations with the West, right? It's what is framed as the fear of a military threat, right? The NATO coming to our borders is really a question of, how can you take something that is ours and treat it as a sovereign state, which precludes the possibility of returning it to the fold, which is actually perceived as a catastrophic and tragic outcome.
Masha, can I sort of pick up on this really great expression, the gatherer of lands, which seems almost a romantic concept, which it isn't, obviously. But can I pick up on that and ask all the three of you, if you had one sentence to describe Putin, a single sentence, how would you describe him? Or a single word, if one comes to mind.
Well, I have a sentence and a word. His KGB nickname was Moth. He's a moth. And in a sentence, I actually forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, I'll come up with a sentence. I had a sentence and I forgot. But if I may actually sort of follow up on what Masha was saying on the gatherer of land, his, one of the things that I think America makes a mistake of, kind of simplistically saying that he wants to re-establish the Soviet Union, he is thinking of himself on the waves of history. I mean, he is, for example, his favorite Tsar was not a Tsar, actually, was a Tsarina, Catherine the Great. And he once memorably said that she was even better than Peter the Great because she gathered more lands and she shed less blood. So he has this kind of examples. And another thing that I think his legacy is not only that he creates, I don't think he's planning to take over, for example, Kazakhstan, although some parts of it, the Russian-speaking will require assistance from the Russians. But this whole stance or standing against the West right now is also, I think, his legacy is we stopped the bleeding. I mean, even if some sort of a agreement would be achieved, we stopped the bleeding of our influence because we are an empire which we treated as such. And I think that's something, if that happens, he may feel that he can leave power. He leave the Kremlin in 2024, although I don't think that he can do because after the Nazarbayev experience, probably at this point, unless he's taken away by his own elites, he's going to be there forever.
If we talk about Putin deciding things, do we really mean that he himself individually decides them, or is there a group of advisors that influence him so much that we have to rather look at a collective there? So is it really, in the end, Putin, the way he's presented on TV, mostly alone, who decides things, especially in foreign policy?
May I jump in here? Sorry, I'll think about a sentence. I'm really boring and not good at these things, so I try to come up with something. And I usually don't talk a lot about Putin himself. So, on his role in decision-making, I think a lot depends on which level of the political system and which policy field you look at. I think foreign and security policy is the most important, and security policy explicitly, not only with a view to foreign relations, but really also with a view to the domestic situation. This is the most important and the most centralized and personalized decision-making process in this political system. And I think there are a few people around him partly overlapping with the Security Council, but only partly. And there are some very, opaque figures who play a role here as well, who may be able to influence him sometimes. But in the end, I think it comes down to which decision Vladimir Putin takes in the end. Let me very briefly say something also, or contribute something to our discussion about legacy. I understand that this plays a role in his thinking, and we all know that there is a lot of debate about this in Moscow and to what extent this drives his policy at the moment. At the same time, I think we should not forget that the new constitution gives him the possibility to stay in power theoretically until 2036. So we're not, this isn't, he's getting older, of course, but we are not at the end of his reign. This is all speculation, of course, but I think the probability that he will run in 2024 and win, of course, is relatively high. So I think, we have to take into account that we're definitely not at the end of his term.
Masha, Nina, any thoughts about who may influence Putin in these decisions? Is that Patrushev or some judo friends from St. Petersburg, or is he on his own?
The honest answer is, once again, we don't know. I think that Putin spends a lot of time alone. He doesn't use the internet, which means that the influence of any one person that he happens to talk to is actually outsized, right? And so I think it's actually a mistake to think of it in a kind of systematic manner, because it's a very, very old-fashioned system where getting the Tsar's ear is kind of a priceless bit of access to influence. So we don't know how particular decisions come to happen. We know he makes them, right? Who he may choose or not choose to talk to in the process. We know that sometimes he's been in the habit of picking somebody's brain and almost sort of consistently making himself a student of a particular person. I don't know that it's happened in recent years, but we know that he's done this in the past. We also know, and I think this is important, that he fancies himself a historian these days. As Tim Snyder once said, he's like your wealthy acquaintance who's an amateur historian, and he really wants to chew off your ear about history, but he doesn't understand anything about the discipline, but he thinks he knows a lot, and this has a huge impact on how he views the world. And I think Sabina was right also to bring up Afghanistan, because I think that the disastrous American withdrawal from Afghanistan has affirmed his view that he understands the world and Americans don't. And he understands the world as part of his legacy. as a KGB agent, as a Soviet leader, as a Russian leader. He understands the world, and Americans never will. And so with that, rich historical understanding and this rich sense of geopolitics, he feels very confident in the world.
From what you have just said, Masha, how rational is his decision-making then, and how emotional?
He believes himself to be a person who is unaffected by emotions, who is all rational. I think we often use the word rational to say that somebody acts in a way that we wouldn't if we were in that position, coming from an entirely different background and an entirely different position in the world. Again, I want to stress that if you look at the Ukrainian aggression of 2014, which I think many of us would have said was not rational, right? That paid off really well. That was, in every way, a regime-building, mobilizing, stabilizing move for Vladimir Putin from his perspective, right? Which is something that none of us would have said 8 years ago. So let's not dismiss him as irrational. In his universe, his behavior is fairly consistent.
I would really agree with that. And I think Crimea is not the only example. I mean, look at Belarus. Why back up an elderly dictator or, ruler, autocratic ruler who clearly lost an election and has lost basically, his entire legitimacy. But there is a rationale behind that because democratic movements in Russia's neighborhood are dangerous for this particular political system. So with this in mind, Moscow's policy in and around Belarus over the past year and a half was consistent.
Can I jump back to the point you all raised in regards to NATO? Putin says that contrary to all agreements between Russia and the West, NATO has expanded further east. Is he right in saying that, in your view?
From his point of view, yes, he's absolutely right, because in 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev was promised in a conversation about Germany, which is important to note, that NATO wouldn't expand an inch to the east. So that is remembered. And in fact, I worked in my early years in America, I worked with the ambassador to the Soviet Union, American ambassador Jack Matlock, who at the time was very well respected. And he himself was saying that the Russians should have taken this in writing, and they never did. And that's kind of created a lot of misunderstanding. But then, of course, the argument, if you read the transcript very carefully, it's not entirely clear that it's not just about East Germany, although I'm sure Gorbachev understood it as such, although later he said that, yes, we were talking about East Germany. But then more important, in 93, with Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin, Secretary of State Warren Christopher, U.S. Secretary of State, said, we're not going to do it. And then that changed because, of course, how do you not to do it when, countries want to feel secure? And in fact, one of the reasons that Putin may be feeling that he's right to say that, but Lavrov said, well, we're polite people because we invite people into our alliances. We're not dragging them. But, it's clear that not like Ukraine or Georgia or other countries or Finland just recently and Sweden just recently are dragged into NATO kicking and screaming. It's the Russian behavior that makes them, even in jest. I mean, I don't know how much Finland really means it, but in jest they want to say that, well, if your Russia tells us, we are not going to do it. So I think it's from Putin's perspective, he got Russia got stood up in a way, and that he wants to rectify. That's why he wants to go back to 97, because that's in 98, the United States Senate ratified the possibility of NATO expansion. And so that's what they firmly want. That's, by the way, another thing that he thinks his legacy should be. He really needs to stop NATO in its tracks, and then he can retire. Although, of course, I agree with Sabine, he's not going to, but at least that's something that he wants to kind of all this miscalculations on the romantic post-1991 developments, he needs to stop, because ultimately it didn't work in the Russian favor, but actually not just the Russian favor, but the Russian imperial favor. It didn't work out. So I think from the Russian point of view, and actually not just Putin point of view, that's certainly something that they would like to get an answer how it happened. That is, by the way, is a popular cause, is that, even critical of the Kremlin people would say, we were screwed up, and therefore we sort of support Putin's questions to NATO and America about NATO.
Maybe I can reframe what you say and put it to Sabine and Masha. So if we look at Putin's view of the West and Putin's view of the world, maybe generally, is that the typical view of the average Russian, or does Putin have a very specific view and interpretation of what the West is and what Russia's place in the world is? So is he representative, or is that a very specific view of the world?
Well, we're talking about an autocrat who has been in office for more than 22 years. So at this point, it's very difficult to separate his view of the world from the country's view of the world, also considering that he's had a monopoly on media for 21 out of those 22 years. Right? I think that emotionally, his emotional relationship to the world is actually highly representative of a lot of Russians' relationship to the world, even before he established a monopoly on the media. So from the very start, this incredible nostalgia for a lost greatness is something that he tapped into from the very beginning. But at this point, we're talking about an entire generation of people who weren't even born before he came into office, who have been completely shaped by a regime built on nostalgia for lost greatness.
I think it's very difficult to answer that question, because indeed, after 20 years of propaganda fire, it's difficult to understand, to what extent people really embrace these messages. He represents certainly the overwhelming majority of the Russian political elite. And he also represents, with his views, the majority of the Russian population. Yeah, the big question is, how much have people embraced this? How have they really internalized this? And then when you look at more specific polls, you get a rather nuanced picture. Because, for instance, if you look at perceptions of the European Union, and I just worked 2 years in Russia, and I did public diplomacy for the European Union in Russia. In other words, we reached out to all kinds of people and supported people-to-people contacts and engagement on a broad variety of issues. And all of a sudden, you get a completely different, very, very granulated picture, and you get perceptions that really don't correspond. Perceptions in Russians of, let's say, the situation in the European Union that absolutely does not correspond with the official propaganda. Yeah. So I think it's very, very complicated to answer that question. Superficially, yes, but then if you dig deeper, it becomes much more complicated.
Can I just add something? I actually don't think necessarily it's about propaganda, because it does seem to, the idea of a great nation is still very important to the Russians, regardless of what the state tells them. I agree with Sabine completely. It depends on what question you ask. And I think that is also very important. But the idea that, Russians don't want to follow, and the idea is that, at least with the American world, is that you either follow America or you are nobody. And that creates a great amount of resentment. I mean, they want to travel, they don't want the borders closed, and yet the idea that America dictates the world, which is not always beneficial to us, to the Russians, and unfair to us, is regardless of the Western propaganda exists. I did a trip a few years ago across all Russian 11 time zones, and, even the most enlightened and anti-Putin young people were kind of very concerned about their own image, although the new polls done recently where Russia less and less wants to be a country of great stature and just want to be a normal country, which is interesting because this whole normal country concept has existed in Russia since 18th century at least. They always want to be a normal country. So I agree. I think it is complex, but the idea that Putin stands for the strong Russia, and we like that, it certainly exists. And I would imagine not necessarily because of insane and blatant propaganda everywhere.
How does Putin think about Germany?
He used to love it. He used to love Schroeder.
But that's over.
He thought he can make... Right. He used to make deals with... he was hoping to make deals with Merkel. Nord Stream 2 is one of the things. I mean, it is kind of I think he also feels, because he's a small man in his thoughts, particularly, and he does feel that he was betrayed. I think especially after Alexei Navalny, he thought he would come up with some sort of a agreement and understanding, and feel completely betrayed that suddenly even Germany misunderstands his idea for Russian greatness.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think Navalny really ended this privileged sort of relationship that existed even between 2014, 2014 and 2020. Yeah. I mean, even after Crimea, even after Germany became a promoter of sanctions within the European Union, and there already was a lot of abida insults in Moscow about that. Even then, there was this kind of privileged relationship and a kind of privileged German position in Russian thinking about the European Union, for instance. But to my mind, this is over. So I think Germany is still, of course, a very important factor because of its economic weight, because of its political weight within the European Union. But this this privilege, it's gone.
Does this have to do with Merkel having left office? What does Merkel's leaving the chancellery mean? How did it affect relations to Germany?
I don't think that this is solely caused by Merkel leaving the chancellery. Also because, the end of this special sort of relationship. I mean, this was, it was during Merkel's term, and she was the one who basically made this public statement, who visited Alexei Navalny in hospital and made this statement about him having been poisoned with Novichok and the responsibility of the Russian state. So that was in August, September 2020. And she left office in December 2021. Now with the new government, there is a lot of trepidation in Moscow about the participation of the Green Party in the government, because the Green Party really, basically, it's everything that's bad in German politics from a Russian perspective. There was, perhaps still is, hope in the Social Democratic Party. And I think generally, with Merkel, of course, an absolute heavyweight of European politics is gone, and necessarily the new German government it's seen as much weaker, new, less experienced, So I think there is really some change in German-Russian relations.
Masha is leaving us, unfortunately. I think we're also at the almost at the end. One question that we had finally, looking maybe beyond the conflict in Ukraine right now. If you think a couple of years ahead, is it conceivable that Putin would attack other or target other Western countries in a way, one way or other?
You mean which Western countries? The former Soviet countries or Western countries?
Well, I'll leave it to you. Former Soviet countries as well as Western countries.
Well, I don't think that he's going to target Western countries. On the other hand, the hybrid targeting is already happening. So I think that will continue. And the more he's not victorious over the standoff in Ukraine, the more hybrid approach to targeting other countries, Western or any other, would be there. In fact, he just met with the Iranians, and Iranians said we should work together to curtail the influence of the United States. It's unclear. I don't know, maybe you already know. I don't know what the Kremlin said to that suggestion, but I'm sure they will certainly threaten it somehow, especially with the nuclear armament of Iran. So yes, I think it will continue. And since he's going to stay on indefinitely, he would need to somehow create a formula for his influence. And if he cannot get it directly, and actually that's why I think that invasion of Ukraine is a kind of almost an American wishful thinking to a degree, because they really want to get Putin this way. I don't think it is, but because whatever he does in secret in a way. If he gives you troops on the border, that doesn't mean that these troops, actually it most likely means that these troops are not going to go. I think one should look into what's hidden in those trenches, or what's hidden. Well, for example, they have another new dispute with Moldova right now over gas and payment and whatnot. So I think, or Kazakhstan, how minimal Tokayev will be to Putin's influence or Putin's demands, and so on and so forth. I think that's where we need to look. And so Putin is not finished with his kind of political judo games, and that's what we should expect. But he's a tactician. He's not a strategist. And as a tactician, we can't know where the openings in the West or Western policies would be in order for the West to protect itself, because they haven't even happened yet. But he will go in as any judo master would.
And how should the West react to this? What's the best way to deal with Putin? Looking for dialogue, looking for confrontation?
Well, I mean, just quickly, I always think that dialogue is better than non-dialogue, because confrontation never got us anywhere, and with Putin too. And I think it is a mistake of Western countries to, kind of ostracize him and whatnot. So I would think that treating meetings with Putin as some sort of a concession to him, I think it's not clever at all. But my fear is that we may have passed the honest dialogue stage, because there's so much mistrust and so much desire to screw the other side over that I don't know what kind of dialogue we're actually having. That's why I keep saying, let's look at what Rybkov says and decipher that, because he seems to be at least navigating in some diplomatic waters rather than either spouting out the Kremlin formulas or showing a muscle the way the Kremlin does, just on purpose to show that he can.
Yeah, very, very briefly, some comments on that. I mean, I think, the main difference really, when you look at countries west of Russia, is whether or not they are members of NATO. And that, of course, puts the neighbors, the post-Soviet neighbors, in a very difficult position. And I think what is of key importance here is, our domestic developments in those countries. And to take the Belarusian example once again, had the democratic movement in Belarus succeeded, I'm sure we would have seen a very different Russian approach. So I think I agree that there is not a lot of strategy in Russia's policy. and that a lot is indeed tactics and also using niches, using windows of opportunity that open, for instance, because Western influence is getting weaker. I mean, I think Russia's policy in the Southern Mediterranean and in Africa is basically guided by that principle. But when it comes to democratic movements in the immediate Russian neighborhood, I think the stabilization and restoration of autocratic governments is something. I mean, it's close to a strategic principle in Russia's policy. And on how to deal with this, I absolutely agree with Nina that talking is and remains very, very important and needs to continue. And at the same time, it needs to be made very clear what the costs of certain actions will be. So I think there needs to be a balance between, on the one hand, talking. I mean, in the German context, the word dialogue is a bit, as you know, has acquired a rather difficult meaning. But talks, interactions, negotiations, and at the same time raising the stakes for Russia and that means to a certain extent also deterrence economically, but also in terms of security, to help avoid situations spiraling out of control.
Thank you so much. That was a great final sentence and an ending to our conversation. I just want to thank you for your thoughts and for the discussion. It will be hard to sort of narrow this down or cut this to 4 pages in the print issue, but we'll do our best. And I'm really much looking forward to both the printed interview and the audio sort of conversation.
Can I have my last line, that line that you wanted? I remembered what I wanted to say. Putin is perfect for Russia, but he's not good for Russia.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That needs some explaining.
Well, to our conversation that, Russians support the imperial formulas of existence. So he's perfect for Russia. They liked him. They wanted him. I mean, not so much now, but still he is reasonably popular. But he's not good for Russia because then Russia continues to be an empire, which, of course, is not a way forward. It doesn't continue to be an empire. It continues to think of itself as an empire, which is not the way forward.
Das war 8 Milliarden, der Auslandspodcast des Spiegel mit einer englischen Sonderausgabe zum Thema Was hat Putin vor? Die reguläre Folge von 8 Milliarden, die sich in dieser Woche mit der deutschen und europäischen Haltung zur Ukraine-Krise beschäftigt, erscheint ebenfalls am heutigen Freitag. Sie finden sie wie stets in unserer Audiothek und auf Ihrer bevorzugten Podcast-Plattform.